Hello and welcome to this Japan Society webinar. My name is Bill Emmott and I have the honor to be chair of the Japan Society as well as to moderate many of these webinars on current affairs and business. I thank you all warmly for your support of the Japan Society and of these online discussions. This month, by a fateful coincidence, both of our countries will be preoccupied by the holding of state funerals, even if of quite different figures, but with all the issues of remembrance and of our constitutions and politics that they raise. But we also share deep preoccupations over the longer term about geopolitics, or more specifically, peace and security. As G7 countries, the UK and Japan are deeply engaged in and concerned by Russia's war in Ukraine, both by what this invasion by a nuclear superpower may mean for the European continent, but also by what it may mean for East Asia. Prime Minister Kishida has been admirably clear about this, notably in his keynote address at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore in early June, that, to quote him, "Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow." Everyone knew that the country he most had in mind with that remark was Taiwan, as well as the broader implications of the Ukraine war and the China-Russia strategic partnership on China's behavior. But then tomorrow came quite quickly, in a sense, when the Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, paid a visit to Taiwan on August the 2nd, along with a group of other Congresspeople, and that led to not merely noisy protests from China, but also the largest and most intrusive set of military exercises around that island that China had ever conducted. Tensions, therefore, are running high. President Joe Biden has been keen to make it clear that in the event of a Chinese military attack on Taiwan, the United States would get directly involved in the defense of Taiwan, even though officially the US policy remains one of so-called strategic ambiguity. Japan's announcement of a big rise in defense spending in its new budget is in part to be dedicated to reinforcing its defense of the Japanese island chain nearby Taiwan, as well as the part its forces would expect to have to play in support of America. So where is this heading? How significant is this summer of tension for the future of Taiwan and of US-China relations? What could this mean for Japan and for the UK and Europe? To discuss those questions, I'm delighted to welcome two really experienced and knowledgeable scholars on the Taiwan issue and on regional security. In London, I welcome Meia Nouwens, Senior Fellow for Chinese Defense Policy and Military Modernization at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, of which, in full disclosure, I should mention that I chair the IISS Board of Trustees. Meia spent part of her childhood in Taiwan, has worked for the EU External Action Service there, and indeed is about to jet off to the region, ultimately Taipei, for an extended visit. And in Japan, currently speaking to us from Hokkaido, normally in Tokyo, I welcome Yasuhiro Matsuda, who is Professor of International Politics at Tokyo University's Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia. Prior to Todai, he spent 16 years at the National Institute for Defense Studies, which indeed was where I first met him. While Meia is about to fly to Taiwan, Matsuda Sensei has just returned from his own extended visit on that island. As usual, I will ask each of our speakers to make opening remarks of up to 10 minutes, following which I will lead a discussion and, most importantly, bring in your questions. As Matsuda Sensei is in East Asia and has just returned from Taiwan, I will ask him to start us off, subject to the strength of his connection to us from his Hokkaido hotel room, which obviously is an issue outside our or his control. But we start optimistically, and I offer my welcome to the Japan Society to you, Matsuda Sensei. Over to you.
Thank you, Bill. Firstly, let me express my deep condolences to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. I think that she's a very great personality to unite the country, and also made a great effort to improve the relations between UK and Japan. I think that she will be living in our memory forever. Yeah, we feel a great loss. Well, getting back to our today's topic, I have just come back from Taiwan just 1 week ago, and I also experienced a Chinese military exercise on that island. So let me give a report to everyone about what I experienced in the island. Basically, the society is quite stable. They were not in panic at all, because this time is quite different from the third Taiwan Strait crisis in the mid 1990s, because the tension was on the rise incrementally. Compared to the last crisis, I think that everyone was kind of prepared, and China was not going to launch a war. It is obviously military intimidation. That's all, and also the United States and Taiwanese authorities were cooperating each other and tried to minimize the tension in the society. So in Chinese media, Taiwanese media in Taiwan didn't utilize the word crisis. They use the word military exercise. So I think that basically the people are very in a stable situation. But the people in the authorities, in the government, and also experts are expecting more serious challenges from next year, because next year, 2023, is a very special year, because Xi Jinping is going to be run for the third term. So it's going to be his first year of his third term. And in Taiwan, there will be a presidential election. The election date is in the January 2024. So next year is going to be a very serious competition between the ruling DPP, pro-independence DPP, and also the anti-independence Kuomintang next year. So in that situation, the China has sent messages to the new administration. For example, in 2015, Xi Jinping met with President Ma Ying-jeou in Singapore. That was a big, strong message to the next president, Tsai Ing-wen. If Tsai Ing-wen admits one China principle, I can give you a lot of things, a lot of carrots, stable relations with the mainland China, and Xi Jinping is willingly to see you. Obviously, it didn't go well, and in the beginning of 2019, when DPP lost the local elections seriously, at that time, DPP was not seen as the winner of the 2020 presidential election. So at that time, Xi Jinping released a very important speech saying that we should discuss the formula of one country, two systems, Taiwan version of one country, two systems. We need to talk. Xi Jinping released these remarks to the Kuomintang, because Kuomintang under Ma Ying-jeou was not that positive on the idea of discussing unification with the Communist Party. Basically, Ma Ying-jeou's policy is keeping the status quo. No unification, no independence, no use of force. But Xi Jinping was pretty much dissatisfied with Ma Ying-jeou. because next step should be the direct discussion on unification and the formula after the unification. We have a kind of misunderstanding. China's definition of status quo is quite different from the rest of the world. The definition of status quo of the rest of the world is simply maintaining the current situation. China is divided into mainland China and Taiwan, and both of them have governments, military, and they have different people and different opinions and so on. And don't fight, keep and maintain the current situation. That's the status quo. But in China's official idea, status quo is that China is not divided. Unification has not achieved it yet. So every day, both sides should moving forward to unification. That is the status quo. So if you insist that keep the current situation, that is the violation of the status quo. That's China's definition of the status quo. So Taiwan should step forward to the unification every day. That's the China's definition of status quo. So the Kuomintang should go forward to the unification, and that statement backfired Taiwanese society Taiwanese society, because China was and is so unpopular. So that kind of compulsory approach was rejected by the Taiwanese. And immediately after that, the Hong Kong's turmoil followed, and the Beijing has violently messed up the situation in Hong Kong. And then immediately after that, the pandemic followed. And lockdown in Wuhan, and even Shanghai was locked down. And this kind of countermeasures of the COVID-19 in China scared a lot of people in Taiwan, because they understand Chinese perfectly. So the approval ratings or the affinity toward China has sharply dropped from 2018 to through 2022. All the opinion polls show that the China has become extremely unpopular in Taiwan, as well as the rest of the world. So actually, the peaceful unification through dialogue is becoming more and more hopeless. And Chinese authorities are quite aware of this reality. But for their political mandate, unification should be achieved, and both sides should step forward to unification every day. So if the peaceful unification through dialogue is hopeless, there should be another way. That's what I call, compulsory peaceful unification, or coercive, peaceful unification. Coercive and peaceful are contradictory each other. It's not peaceful at all. But China is heading toward this approach to take many actions. So I think that although society is very stable, the Taiwanese government and the military are preparing for very serious challenges from next year. Xi Jinping is going to send a stronger message to Taiwan that without bluntly thing without in surrender, China is going to take coercive measures. That kind of situation may occur anytime in the near future. Actually, China doesn't have enough capability to actually attack and occupy the whole island of Taiwan. Especially that is true when the risk of US intervention exists. But on the other hand, China doesn't like to hear that other people say that China doesn't have any capability to occupy Taiwan, because this kind of discourse truly hurt their face, and also this kind of discourse may embolden the pro-independence forces in Taiwan. So anyway, China will have to keep pressure on Taiwan by non-peaceful means. I think that this is going to be happening, and last month, military intimidation was just the beginning of Xi Jinping's, approach to Taiwan. Let me stop here. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Matsuda Sensei. That's been very, very helpful as a framing of the situation. Thank you especially for pointing out the salience of Taiwan's election in January 2024 and the way in which that could play into thinking and planning in the next year. But also, I think also your point about the definition of the status quo is also a very salutary reminder about how both sides or how look at this differently. So we'll come in the questions, I'm sure, to some issues about how Japan views this, and I'll definitely be interested in your views on that. But meanwhile, let's switch to Meia Nouwens. And how do you see that from London, Meia?
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to Matsuda-san for your excellent remarks. I think they paint a very accurate picture of what's happening across the strait and in the sentiment in Taiwan at the moment as well. So I've been asked to speak a little bit about Europe's response to Taiwan and how European capitals are viewing what's happening around Taiwan at the moment, and how this fits into a wider context of EU-Taiwan relations of late. And what I would say first and foremost is that in response to Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, European capitals actually made relatively mild and few political statements. I think only Lithuania directly supported Pelosi's trip, and it was limited to the G7 and the European Union's High Representative and Vice President, Mr. Borrell, who condemned China's military exercises. And that was pretty much the extent of it. Overall, I think European companies here still determine quite a lot of Taiwan policy. And European companies, at the end of the day, are still highly invested in the Chinese market, even though we've heard talks of decoupling over the last few years. Of course, not much of that has eventuated. And I think the private sector is, instead of focusing on decoupling, looking at diversifying their supply chains instead. And so I think politically, militarily, economically, European countries are very much still finding their footing with regards to balancing the relationships with Taiwan and with China. Now, when it comes to that economically, I think those, as I've said, fundamentally haven't changed in the past few decades. European countries, of course, have deep ties with the Chinese market, but they also, of course, have had growing and diversifying ties with Taiwan as well, slowly diversifying their bilateral relationships economically away from just seeing Taiwan as a manufacturing hub, but also relying on Taiwan heavily for its key node in the supply chain around advanced technological components such as semiconductor chips. So there is an interest in Europe about Taiwan, but I'd say that in the past that's been a predominantly economic interest. Bilaterally, relations between Europe and Taiwan in terms of political relations, of course, have followed a one China policy as determined by European capitals themselves. Though I would argue that these have diversified quietly over the last decade or so. Taiwan's democracy, of course, over time has flourished and become one of the most liberal societies in East Asia, especially in the area of, for example, LGBTQ rights. This, of course, has stuck in stark contrast to President Xi and his view of China and the increasingly authoritarian turn he has taken China over the last few years. And so European countries have increasingly seen Taiwan as more of a like-minded partner. Now, I would argue, though, that European states today then, and the European Union as well, have a more diversified portfolio in terms of their relationship with Taiwan. They look, for example, to Taiwan when it comes to the circular economy, when it comes to combating climate change, when it comes to social issues and norms and values, how to combat disinformation, a wide plethora of different topics, cybersecurity, cooperation even. But overall, as I said, European states and the European Union, for the most part, have been wary, and to some extent still are wary, of balancing those economic ties between China and expanding economic ties and political ties with Taiwan. And so therefore, I think we've seen that real adherence to a one China policy that has been quite rigid by European capitals in the past and has seen very little overt movement in terms of shifting the definition thereof. I think Beijing has played a role in that, often conflating, perhaps purposely, the one China principle that it holds with the one China policy that European and other capitals hold. And so overall, I think Europeans have as well been wary of rocking the boat a little bit too much across the strait in their relations with China and Taiwan, for fear also of threats by Beijing of potential economic coercion, which, if you look at the data, have actually turned out to be more bark than bite. I think there has been a turning point of late in terms of how European countries view and interact Taiwan. And I would say that this wasn't necessarily the Pelosi trip. I think this predates that and goes back to the COVID-19 pandemic. European countries, I think, have begun through the COVID-19 pandemic to understand their vulnerabilities more clearly vis-a-vis their heavy reliance in some areas on the Chinese and indeed also Taiwanese supply chains. Secondly, China's response to COVID, both at home in China, but also its subsequent harsh wolf warrior language directed at the West by Chinese diplomats in Europe, has brought Chinese assertiveness and domestic authoritarianism and the consequences thereof really to light more clearly for the average European citizen. Thirdly, I would say that in certain countries like the United Kingdom, certainly what happened in Hong Kong, the crackdown on protests that we saw and the imposition of the national security law have also connected the British citizen more directly to events that are taking place in East Asia. I don't think this necessarily counts for Taiwan just yet, but this is a PR question and a narrative question, and also a question of how we convince our publics moving forward that Taiwan actually matters to them. That still is an ongoing question. And last of all, of course, add to all of these things the illegal and detention of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and also, of course, China's stance to the war in Ukraine. And overall, you're seeing a whole new landscape in Europe evolve, whereby opinions of China, public opinions of China, have never rated more low than they currently do. And so criticism of China is quite high. However, despite this, again, I go back to my earlier point, which is that despite this changed perception, we haven't yet seen substantive policy changes by European states to balance its political and economic interests when it comes to China and Taiwan. I would say that the vast minority of European countries have been proactive. Lithuania is an example in terms of abandoning a relation with Taiwan, with China, and deepening engagements with Taiwan, although not diplomatic recognition. That would be a step too far. But of course, we have to remember that Lithuania had a very, very small trade dependence on China in the first place to begin with. And so I don't think that necessarily, excuse me, Lithuania's example is one that's going to be replicated more broadly across the European continent. European parliaments, I think, have been particularly active in terms of engaging with Taiwan more openly and more critically of China as well. And so we've seen the European Parliament send delegations to Taiwan. The UK is also likely to send a House of Commons delegation in the next few months to Taipei as well. But by and large, most European economies, I think, remain interested in deepening relations with Taiwan for quite practical reasons, whether they be related to the alliance with the United States, or also, of course, their dependence and their interest in Taiwan's chip manufacturing capabilities through largely TSMC's monopoly in the area of advanced semiconductor chips. And the interest here, of course, is not just in helping Taiwan use this as a silicon shield, if that is a concept that we want to buy into, but also, of course, whether or not those capabilities can be offshored from Taiwan and onshored onto Europe. And so far, I think that is still a negotiation that's happening and taking place, although I would question how likely that actually is. Now that brings me to defense questions. And of course, there was a defense, I think, a large condemnation of the exercises that the PLA undertook around Taiwan following Pelosi's visit. When it comes to European defense ties with Taiwan, though, I would say that these are still extremely sensitive and broadly off limits for most European, if not all European governments. Questions of defense with the defense ties with Taiwan are limited to indirect ties between a very few small number of European companies with strengths in particular areas of defense production. Think, for example, of submarine technology. And second of all, European countries who have ongoing maintenance contracts with Taiwan for older equipment and platforms that Taiwan still has in its inventory. Taiwan still, at the end of the day, remains highly reliant on the United States for arms sales and transfers, as well as a deepened investment by the Tsai administration over the last few years into Taiwan's indigenous capabilities. European capitals are behind the scenes thinking about what a Taiwan scenario might mean to them. However, and whenever one might take place in the future, discussions in European capitals, however, are, I think, starting to take shape around the role that Europe can play in with regards to sanctions, should something ever happen, but also what might be expected of US allies in the event of a Taiwan contingency. I think most European capitals are highly cognizant of their resource limitations when it comes to a Taiwan contingency. And so most of these discussions are always going to take place in the context of how to support the United States in a Taiwan contingency, rather than how to play a leading role in a Taiwan contingency, militarily speaking. In some cases, I think these discussions have been bilaterally discussed with the United States, but by and large, these are very, very nascent discussions that are taking place. So I don't think we should read too much into them for the moment. We also, of course, need to understand that for the moment, the prioritization with regards to European resources is going to be directed at European security at home and in its own region and backyard, rather than a Taiwan contingency. I think what we are starting to see has been helpful in some ways. It's helpful to understand and to get some greater clarity on where European states stand with regards to Taiwan and their policies with regards to Taiwan should a contingency occur. However, I would also warn and caution that some statements that have been made have been incredibly unhelpful. Take, for example, the now Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Liz Truss's statement that the UK should have started arming Taiwan a long time ago to help defend itself. Now, of course, that implied that the UK has already started arming Taiwan. So I think at the end of the day, this is also a question about Europeans learning to how to talk about Taiwan constructively in the open, in an open debate, and beyond closed door settings in which they normally would take place. Ultimately, I think should a Taiwan contingency take place, and I'm of the view that this will be later rather than sooner, fully accepting the pressures that are on President Xi Jinping and that narrowing window of opportunity for peaceful reunification, I think certain factors will determine Europe's response. The first, of course, is the domestic context in which Europe faces itself at the time. Secondly, the transatlantic relationship between the US and Europe, and of course, the United States' initial response to a Taiwan contingency. Thirdly, Europe's relationship with China and what the state is. Fourthly, of Europe's tilt to the Indo-Pacific at that time when this eventually may happen. And I think at the moment, none of these factors are certain, and all of these factors are still something that European capitals are discussing behind closed doors. And I'll leave it at that, though.
Thank you very, very much, Mayor. That's a wonderful overview of the European stance and the European relationships and the European complexities, really, but also how, in some ways, how we're very much at the start of Europe thinking hard about this issue. I should have pointed out when I opened this that the reason that just over my shoulder here is the words IISS or the letters IISS is because I'm doing this webinar from the IISS Berlin office, because I happen to be in Berlin today. It's not because I'm wearing two hats at the same time. I'm wearing the Japan Society hat right now, but nevertheless, that's why it's behind my shoulder. Now, we've got some questions coming in, and I encourage other members of the audience to put in their questions. Before getting to the questions that are in, though, I want to just ask both of you if you could, in addition to what you've already said about the relations between China and Taiwan, just give your sense of what impact, if any, does, as it were, the economic and political strength of China at any given moment make in its calculations and in the relationship with Taiwan. I ask this question because at the moment, clearly China is in a difficult economic situation with post-COVID, zero-COVID policy, with its property difficulties as well, and suffering the energy crisis like the rest of us. Do the ups and downs of China's strength or weakness economically play a role at all in thinking about Taiwan? Or should we just consider this to be, as it were, a seasonally adjusted, independent issue of economic strength or otherwise? Matsuda Sensei, what's your attitude to Chinese strength or not? Which comes down to the question of whether time is on China's side.
Well, that's a very good question. There are two different views on this issue. One is a diversionary war theory. When the country is in a very difficult situation, especially in the domestic field, the dictatorial government tends to resort to a kind of military action to others, try to divert the tension from domestic to the outside. That's one theory. The other theory is much more reactionary theory. That's the people like Taylor Fravel in MIT in the United States insist that China tends to take very strong measures when China thinks that she is pushed by others. In the if U.S. push too much, China may take a very extreme position. So it depends on Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping's psychology is very important, and he is now running for the third term. And usually China's reaction could be much more, a kind of a usual exercise in the theory. But Xi Jinping is a very special personality. and he is really devoted to achieve his political goal, and he did it in Hong Kong, and he thinks that that is a successful case. So I think that if he only has 5 years or maybe 10 years, I think that he will try very hard to actually, solve the problem. That's the full invasion, or before that, he will he makes an effort to, let Taiwan surrender. So without killing anyone, he can merge Taiwan. But if he fails, use the force. I think that this kind of this is not just a matter of his surroundings. This is a matter of a political will, and China is a very big economy. So arbitrarily, China can pour more resources to the military side. ICBMs are very cheap. Vessels are very cheap. So I think that this kind of policy choice can be made. I think that China, no matter what happens in the economic side, will build up more military, especially in the field of nuclear weapons, and try to prevent U.S. from intervening in the Taiwan Strait situation. So I think that it's a kind of due course.
Okay, well, thank you. No, that's helpful. Meia, how do you think about this? You've said that you think that this contingency is further ahead rather than nearer. That perhaps implies part of your answer, but that means once China is a more aging society like Japan, so does this make any difference?
So I think actually the reason I said that is because I look at the PLA and its modernization on a day-to-day basis. And the first thing I would like to say, of course, I completely agree that capability does not equal political will. So China could have all the capability in the world and still decide not to take military action to force reunification as they see it. But what I would say is that with regards to the PLA and their modernization goal of 2035, is that there is still quite a lot that needs to be done at home in order for those forces to be combat ready and for Beijing to be 110, if not 120% sure that success is guaranteed. Because ultimately, if this were a battle against just Taiwan, probably they'd be a lot more confident. But at the end of the day, regardless of, for example, America's strategic ambiguity position, this in the mind of the PLA, in the mind of Central Military Commission's leadership, is always going to be a battle between the United States and China over Taiwan, and now perhaps potentially in the worst case scenario, the United States and Japan and potentially like-minded militaries as well. So it's suddenly becoming a lot more complex, and the PLA's modernization has not achieved what it needs to achieve by that deadline. And I would just on that like to explain perhaps to our audiences who don't look at this on a day-to-day basis that we see a lot of really impressive change within the PLA. We see fifth generation aircraft, we see aircraft carriers, submarine capabilities, which are increasingly advanced. But what I'm talking about here is really that connective, softer element of modernization that has to do with personnel, which has to do with training, doctrine, strategy, integrated joint operations, all of these things that are extremely, extremely difficult to do for our militaries if you're thinking about a modern great power war, but on the other hand are even more difficult for a military that has been so heavily siloed in the past and so land focused and now needs to be air, maritime, space, and cyber focused. So there's a lot that needs to be done in a very short amount of time if we want to see, if China would like to see forced reunification be successful in the near-term future. That doesn't, of course, mean that a decision can't be taken to reunify Taiwan by force should Beijing feel the need to do so. And there are certain things that I think will make that more clear. Certainly, there are red lines from Xi's perspective. I think if Taiwan declared independence tomorrow, well, then I think there would be very little choice left for the PLA not to intervene. But short of that, I think, what type of weapons Taiwan acquires in the next 5 to 10 years will be important. How they seek to help Taiwan bolster its defenses and perhaps even more offensive capabilities. I think all of these things will tip the balance one way or another in terms of feeling the need to act before necessary. At the end of the day, I would like to emphasize that for Chinese decision-making, and though we cannot understand and we cannot know what President Xi is thinking, and he is the only one that will be making this decision, I think it is certain that over the past few years through his leadership, he has emphasized how much of a core issue Taiwan is for not just him or the PRC, but for the CCP itself. And so not achieving this goal, but even worse, trying to achieve this goal and failing would be an existential problem for the CCP. And so hence my initial assessment that for military reasons, but also for political reasons within China, this is going to be something that isn't left to opportunism because the rest of the world is focused on Ukraine. We saw that that didn't happen. This isn't going to be left to a moment of instability to redirect attention outside of China, away from the party. We didn't see that during COVID. And I think it's not something that's going to be left to a whim at the end of the day. It's something that is going to be considered. And if I may, just very, very lastly, I actually think that the exercises that were undertaken following Pelosi's trip were extremely considered from the Chinese perspective in terms of the weapons they used, in terms of what they chose not to use, and also in terms of the types of exercises that they conducted as well.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. Matsuda Sensei, you're waving. So,
there is a very interesting phenomenon. If you are an excellent China watcher, you will see that PLA is just a paper tiger. It can fight. But if you are a very good Taiwan expert, and Taiwanese military is also a paper tiger. It can't defend itself. And if you are a true expert on the United States, you will never believe that the US would intervene in the Taiwan Strait crisis. So, because US is so divided, and US doesn't want to fight a war with China. But something may occur. I think that this is that's the real world, and we should not fall into the pitfall of experts. Thank you. This is not a joke. I'm sorry.
No, but your point that the possibility you've got basically a triangular relationship, number one, and secondly, the chances of a calculation being based on both what's happening with you, but also what's happening on the other sides of the triangle is, of course, fundamental to the issue. Now, I've got some questions in, and I'm going to come to 2 questions about Japan, because I think we should bring in the Japanese element. Duncan Bartlett, who's from the SOAS, School of Oriental African Studies, China Institute, points out that Japan has recently changed defense ministers from Kishi-san to Hamada-san. How do you, Matsuda Sensei, how do you see the political situation in Tokyo in relation to China and Taiwan? And a connected question comes from Martin Hatfull, Deputy Chair of the Japan Society, asks, how strong is Japanese public support for Taiwan? If China started building pressure on Taiwan, would a majority of Japanese voters expect Japan's government to provide practical support to Taiwan or not? How do you think about those 2 questions together?
Thank you for very good questions. I think that the Japanese public is really, really worried about the possibility of China's attack on Taiwan. In some opinion polls, more than 90% of the Japanese public are worried about that. And this is even more true after the Ukraine war. Because, a lot of people simply thought that it would never happen, but it happened, and we have witnessed that President Putin's, behavior and his, words and attitudes. And the people simply feel that everything is upside down. Truth becomes lie, and lie becomes truth. And the Japanese public also feel the similar thing in China. So, the Japanese people have many year, engagement with the Chinese, and the people are really worrisome. And also, more than 70% of the Japanese public think that Japan should do something to stabilize the situation in the Taiwan Strait. I think this is a very extremely high number because in Japan, the international affairs are not the focus, basically. More than 90% or 70% of the people are worried. But the reality is that the Japan's policy framework is that without US direct intervention, Japan cannot do much things. Just sending aircrafts and vessels and gather information, share with the United States and so on. Once US decides to intervene into the situation, Japan, of course, Japan can assist US forces, that including, live ammunitions and fuels and so on. But not weapons. That's the Japanese, restriction. But the basic, situation is Japan doesn't have a policy framework to do something alone. Japan can do something, but only with the United States. And that's the current situation. So the Japan's actual role is very limited, but the people are really worried about the current situation.
Thank you.
Once more, the Kishida Prime Minister changed the defense ministers, and he also changed the vice minister of the defense, executive vice minister of the defense, and also he changed the personnel of the director of the defense. Defense inside the Ministry of Defense. I think that Kishida wanted to be more independent from the influence of Abe and Suga administration. But this is a little bit surprising, move, because the Ministry of Defense is going to draft 3 strategic documents this year, and also going to increase the defense budget in a fundamental way. And this is a quite tough situation for all the personnel in the Ministry of Defense. And the top leaders, very important leaders, were removed. It's a big challenge for the Ministry of Defense. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mayor, you follow the region very closely. Simon Shelton, who's consultant to the defense industry, asks also about what impact Russia-Ukraine is having on attitudes to Taiwan within the Northeast Asian region. I know you're about to go to Singapore, but and therefore perhaps we should ask you next week. But what's your sense of how other countries in the region have reacted and what their view is of the Taiwan situation?
So I think countries in not just Northeast Asia, but wider Asia have taken some interesting stances with regards to how they responded to Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Singapore notably, stepped away, and some other countries stepped away from their long-held neutral position and made some statements that were actually a little more aligned with the West's response. When it comes to Taiwan, however, and I will have a more updated view on this in 2 weeks' time when I return, but from my discussions throughout this year, and this will be my 4th trip to Singapore this year, I would argue that most see the likelihood of a war across the Taiwan Strait as a lot lower than how we view it in Europe. It seems to be more stable. Now, I understand that from Japan's perspective, that's different. Japan faces different pressures and is right on the receiving end of Chinese assertiveness, military assertiveness more directly, and of course closer to Taiwan. But I would say that in Southeast Asia, for example, when I speak to interlocutors, they still view this as a rational decision that President Xi will make at some point in the distant future, rather than a rash decision that will be made in the near-term future.
Thank you. No, that makes a lot of sense. Let me move to these questions about what coercive peaceful unification might look like. What should we be expecting short of, as it were, shock and awe type military action? We've got a question from an anonymous attendee, but asking about, does China really need full spectrum joint arms invasion capacity, or really just enough scare tactics to enforce a blockade for a few weeks? It's hard to imagine the US and later Japan attempting to conduct a modern version of the Berlin airlift, which is a fair point, and perhaps a lesson or the surprise with Ukraine was that President Putin gave up his, in effect, salami tactics and went for a once and for all invasion, which has now been seen to fail. What form do you think progressive intimidation of Taiwan would look like, and how would others respond to it? Perhaps may I start with you and then Matsuda Sensei.
Sure, I think it's an excellent question. I think when it comes to salami slicing tactics or tactics just short of war, we often talk about a couple of things, and that is the takeover or assertiveness or declaration of control over Taiwan's smaller islands first, in order to then show that reunification is inevitable. Alternatively, there's a question of whether or not China is able to economically dislocate Taiwan from the rest of the Indo-Pacific. So isolate Taiwan economically through, for example, increasingly sign its own bilateral or minilateral or multilateral trade initiatives. So I think that question arose particularly after RCEP. I think third of all, people quickly turn to the question of a naval or an aerial blockade. We have to remember that those under international law are acts of war, even though kinetic activity might not be involved. And so I wouldn't necessarily count that as under the threshold of warfare. In the event of, I think, both taking smaller islands or enacting a blockade of some sort, the PLA isn't going to be doing this without being prepared for a full-scale invasion, because ultimately, these are about testing the United States and other allies' responses, and indeed Taiwan's response. That test can fail. And so from Beijing's perspective, undertaking those without being completely prepared for a possibility of a full-scale war would be extremely risky. And therefore, I think it's difficult for us to separate these types of actions from a full-scale invasion. I think we need to see them as a continuum. I think we need to see them as interconnected, and therefore we need to be prepared for all eventualities, not just limited ones.
Thank you. Very interesting. Matsuda Sensei, how do you see this?
Yeah, I totally agree with Meia. There are many versions of use of force, but we have to think clearly that for example, first, full invasion is very difficult. China doesn't have a capability to accomplish it. Especially that's true if there is the risk of U.S. intervention. And the limited use of force, well, yes, China has that capability, but what for? What is the purpose to do that? Taking over Itu Aba in South China Sea? Well, by doing that, maybe it will trigger very negative reactions from the Southeast Asian nations. and also, Taiwan and the rest of the world may take it as the first step of military full invasion to Taiwan, and the rest of the world will have to prepare for that. So it's not a good idea for China to take a limited actual use of force. Rather, China tends to use force without making any casualties, and also without making any changes of the borders. That's a kind of military operations military provocation type operations. That has been done for many times, and this time is also can be categorized as the military provocation. And if this kind of provocation doesn't make any casualties and doesn't make any changes of the borders, Taiwan and the United States will remain very calm, and they will not choose escalation. So China's political purpose can be achieved. That is, for example, this time the major political purpose of China was to show domestic audience that U.S. is doing very wrong thing, and we have punished them. Both United States and Taiwan. The Xi Jinping is a legitimate leader. He is a very tough leader. I think that there are many purposes of the military maneuvers, but this is the major purpose, domestic purpose, and that is quite effective. That's why the military exercise was done during the Peitaihe conference, and right before the party congress in the next month. So still China's in this stage only doing some military intimidation. Don't dare to actually use force and kill people and change the border. Bill, unmute, please.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I don't know how that happened. I didn't touch it. But anyway, it must be a machine I don't know about. And a few seconds left. Maybe I could just finish by asking Meia, which links on from what Matsuda Sensei has just come. I mean, John Nash asked, how secure is Xi Jinping's position in Beijing? Which is to say, to what degree, insofar as we know about Chinese politics, what should we be looking at and looking for in trying to at least map, as it were, the changing tides in China itself?
Oh yeah, the million-dollar question. I think, honestly, from what I've seen, President Xi is in a very strong position at home. That does not mean that criticism does not exist. That criticism is directed at policies rather than directly at him. And I think that by and large, he is going to enter his third term with some real domestic difficulties, but not necessarily an unstable political leadership or unstable control over China, politically speaking. I think what would be interesting to see following the 20th Party Congress, of course, is who's in and who's out of the Politburo Standing Committee and Central Committee, to see who he replaces some key allies who might be retiring with, and even some former key allies who have been increasingly outspoken on some of the policy issues that he's championed. And so I think that will be an indication again of how stable he will be in the next 5 years, moving through his third term. Lastly, when you want to look at how stable President Xi is and you want to understand the political landscape in China, look at where blame is being directed. I think that really can't be underestimated. What we've seen throughout the last 2.5 years, almost 3 years of COVID crises in China and economic crises, is that often more a different figurehead in the government is pushed out into the public domain to take the blame for certain failures. When that starts to change, then his political control, I think, will be slightly weakened, and it will be an indication, I think, of what we see. Second of all, and very important for Taiwan, is how in line the PLA is with what we're hearing from leadership, civilian leadership. So far, the two are aligned, and the PLA is, by and large, following civilian leadership control. When you start hearing different voices, that's when we should also be concerned, I think.
Thank you. Very good bellwethers, and an excellent way to finish this very, very stimulating discussion. I thank you both very warmly for taking the time to be with us. I wish you good travels back to Singapore and to Taipei, Meia. I wish you a good week of teaching in Hokkaido, and hope to see you in Tokyo, Matsuda Sensei, before long. And I thank the audience very much for some excellent questions. And for your support for the Japan Society. So with that, thank you all, and we'll look forward to following this extremely important issue in future events, I'm sure. Thank you very much to you both.